Right. Welcome to A Growing Concern. We're going to spend the greater part of the next couple of weeks talking about genetic engineering. We tried to pass the ban, or the labeling. Banning would be nice, like they did in Southern Oregon and Josephine and Jackson County, but at least labeling. We didn't make it. Vermont did, and people are going to keep trying. But when people think about genetic engineering, they think about genetic engineered food, and mostly that's what it is. But there's also trees that they're genetic engineering. And I've got Mark Des Marets with Northwest Resistance Against Genetic Engineering, Northwest Rage, nwrage.org. Great name, great organization. And Mark's been on the program before, I think more than once actually, and he's going to be going on a tour soon, along with some other folks from, Ashland through Portland up to Seattle, and maybe even
all the way up to BC.
All the way up to BC. That's right, up into Vancouver. So we'll talk a little bit about Mark, and the only thing I could think of offhand, off the top of my head, is a problem with genetic engineered trees is they would, pollinate and maybe make a mess of the trees around them, like the grass did here in Oregon. I think central in Oregon it was growing and it adulterated plants.
The bent grass.
Bent grass, yeah. So other than that, I don't really understand off the top of my head why the objections to it. And Mark, you might go into a little bit of, genetic engineering means they get in there and they do some stuff on the genetic level, the DNA and all that. So what do they do, and what are they trying to achieve?
Yeah, well, it's the executives and the scientists of the biotech corporations who just for some reason cannot see the only way they look at these forests is they see the forest for their genes.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And they look at it as a moneymaker. And so what they want to do is they want to domesticate trees, which literally trees have not really been domesticated. Agricultural crops have been domesticated.
That's a good
for
point.
Hundreds and thousands of years. And trees are really, we got fruit trees and whatnot, but they really haven't been domesticated, and they're actually having a hard time doing it. And so their main focus is eucalyptus, poplar, and in the case of a company up in Canada called Okanagan Specialty Fruits, they have just completed the deregulation or the ability to commercialize Granny Smith and Golden Delicious apples for the ridiculous trait of non-browning. So when you slice this apple and you leave it in the air, it won't turn brown.
They'll be working on avocados next.
Well, the company is also working on peaches and pears and plums and cherries and all these things too. But it's one of those things, it's this very small market of the sliced fruit market that is even impacted by browning of apples.
Mm-hmm.
But they used a double-stranded RNA system they didn't insert another gene from another organism into the apple. They kind of silenced a gene that was already in the apple.
Just turned it off then.
They silenced a gene, 4 genes out of 10 that actually cause browning.
Mm-hmm.
And literally this tree, which the Gerber has decided not to ever use, McDonald's has decided not to ever use, and the U.S. Apple Association and the Washington State Apple Association have both come out mildly but against it, because the apple just has this great visual to it. It's this great apple a day keeps the doctor away. We have all these great ideas and ideology and memes around apples.
Mom and apple pie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the apple industry is very scared because the public really doesn't like genetic engineering of their food. And so they're very worried. It is now commercialized. It'll be a few years before it comes on the market. So this year there are no GE apples. They're called Arctic apples, trademarked. And so it'll be a few years before the trees grow up and actually start producing. And the company, interestingly, said that they would actually label their product as Arctic apples. Granted, you have to know that Arctic is genetically engineered.
Right.
It's not going to have a biohazard symbol on it or anything. So at least they are going to label it as Arctic. So our push, of course, is to get more companies to say no to using it in their products, and then to educate the public as well
What Arctic
that
means.
this product
Yeah.
might be coming on the market, and its name is Arctic. And if you see a Granny Smith or a Golden Delicious apple with that sticker on it, you make the choice whether to buy it or not.
Yeah, I see some educational pickets in your future.
Oh yes, the graphics will be awesome because the apple is such a meme, you know.
Yeah,
apple a
yeah.
day and yeah.
And of course that is the on the fruits end, but the other ones you mentioned are going to be growing for probably paper, I would suspect.
Yeah, the eucalyptus arborgen out of North Carolina or South Carolina is going to be putting in some petitions to the USDA to try and get genetically engineered eucalyptus to be grown in the South. And on this tour that we're doing, the Growing Threat Tour, we're going to be focusing more on the poplar because the poplar is being already grown in Oregon and Washington in massive plantations. Hybrid poplars are being grown here now. Again, there are no GE poplar trees yet grown.
But they're working on it. Yeah.
Well, Steve Strauss at Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon, he's been working for many years, probably 2 decades, on engineering different traits into the poplar tree. BT, the Bacillus thuringiensis, the pesticide that kills all larvae that would maybe eat the leaves. And he's introducing sterility and low lignin content into these trees. And he's done 98 to 2001, so a 3-year field trial of 400 trees in Oregon. And the traits were expressed, supposedly normally. And then after those field trials were over, he then put a bunch of those trees into a clone bank at OSU. And for the last 10 years, supposedly those trees have expressed those traits continually.
Those traits meaning exactly
The BT expression, so it produces the
Right.
BT pesticide in
And
every
the-
cell of the plant.
and the low lignin.
The low
Which
lignin.
interferes with making paper.
Well, the reason that they're doing low lignin trees is to make the process of making paper cheaper for the industry. So when they make paper, they have to break down all the fibers in a tree, and the lignin is a really strong fiber. It helps the tree stand up. It also is a pest-resistant aspect of the trees, and so they're doing low lignin so that when they make the trees through the craft paper process, where they break down those fibers, it'll be cheaper because there won't be as much lignin, which is hard to separate.
Why don't they just grow hemp?
Well, there's as I always say, genetic engineering is a solution in search of a problem. And so
There are other solutions.
well, for every reason that the biotech industry gives us for requiring a non-browning apple or a low lignin tree or a pesticide producing tree, we already have either the technology or techniques or methods that can do the exact same thing.
Sure.
Or, and like in the case of the non-browning apple, the Arctic apple, people for decades have been using a little bit of lemon juice or vitamin C as well as apple juice to coat that cut apple, and it doesn't brown.
Yeah, and I think sometimes all you need is a little education. You know,
Right, and
not
that's
necessarily in this case, but there are cases where you just educate people, and it would take care of having to genetically engineer instead.
yeah, and that's what this tour is about. We're here to educate and explain to people that the Pacific Northwest will be, or is designed to be, a center for these massive plantations of these GE poplars. And Steve Strauss is also, and the other scientists are also trying to create sterility in these trees, which has a whole range of different problems. For one, sterility is unattainable. You cannot get 100% sterility. So like the Boardman plant or the Boardman farm called Evergreen that has 25,000 acres of hybrid poplars, there's a couple million trees out there. And if you can't get 100% sterility, you're going to get 98%. So 2% of those million trees is a whole bunch of trees that are continue to produce pollen and seeds and whatnot, and they will then spread that genetic engineering to the wild poplars. And there's at least 30 different species of moth that depend on poplars for their life cycle. They eat the leaves, eat the pollen, eat the seeds, etc. And if you have a tree that is sterile, that doesn't produce any pollen, then you've completely impacted that whole
vector,
ecosystem in many different ways, all up the food chain, from the birds that are going to eat the moth larvae to all the other critters that are going to eat the birds, etc. Like, there will not be, it'll basically be a desert.
Yeah, exact opposite of bioaccumulation.
Yep.
Biodesert.
Yeah.
And all this is just in order to make a buck. It pretty much is the way you're saying it, because how much more would and how much easier would the process be? I mean, I doubt it would be all that much.
Well, supposedly in the U.S., Americans consume about 800 pounds of wood fiber paper products per year, which is high. And if you think about it, how much little more recycling that you could do of paper products to reduce that and just negate the need for increasing biomass and increasing, having these genetically engineered plantations. The other aspect with the poplars, they want to grow them for biofuels.
Meaning they want to make biogas out of it?
No, they want to grow the tree, grind it into pellets, put it into a burner, and make electricity out of it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the carbon footprint of that is basically as equal as coal. So that's not a good solution either to our carbon problem or our electricity problem. But that's one of the other aspects that they want to do. They want to make the eucalyptus and the poplar and the radiata pine and the loblolly pine and all these other trees to grow quicker. And when you make a tree sterile, about 25% of its normal growth goes into reproduction. So when you make a tree sterile, it's going to have extra energy to basically grow and not grow seeds and pollen and all that. So they're trying to make these trees grow faster as well.
Wouldn't that possibly have unintended consequences? The fact that they cut back on the whole sexual process and hoping that would make them grow faster? Couldn't it do other things?
Well, it definitely will, because if you have this loss of pollen by making a tree sterile, you're going to have this whole impact on the food chain. And Bt is a bacteria that is normally found in prairie soils and grasslands. And forest ecosystems are fungally dominated, so they have fungi that dominate their soil systems. So when you get the absolutely will happen, the contamination of native forests, because there's no way to contain this pollen and there's no way to make 100% sterility of these trees, so you will have contamination of native forests. So when that happens, you then get the Bt exuding out of the roots, the Bt toxin falling with the leaves and decomposing in the branches, etc. So that soil then becomes more bacterially dominated and not fungally dominated, which those forest trees require fungi to survive. And so and they of course haven't studied that, but that will completely affect the soil food web and the whole rhizosphere and the whole mycorrhizae situation, all the whole interconnections between the soil and trees.
The whole foundation is what they're messing with.
Basically the exact foundation of all that, yeah. So there's that, and these plantations, I mean, you can see them out in Boardman. Yeah, there's some deer cruising around in there, and there's some birds and whatnot, but it's basically a biological desert. It's an absolute monoculture, straight lines, straight rows of trees. And in Boardman, it's basically a desert, so they're using really large amounts of water to grow these trees. And the system, or the industry, is also trying to get trees to grow faster to reduce the time it takes for them to reach their maturity level for harvest. if you get a crop under 10 years, there's a lot less regulation. So an agricultural crop like corn or whatnot, there's a lot less regulation from the EPA and USDA and all that. So if they can get these tree crops to be less than 10 years, then they're also saving and not having to abide by a little bit stronger regulations for the growing of them.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned water, and I was going to bring that up. I think I've read about activists going up against the biotech industry over the eucalyptus because they use so much water.
Yep.
And I think they're grown in the southeast, aren't they? Didn't you mention that the poplar were too?
Well, the eucalyptus, they want to grow them in the southern U.S. States. And yeah, they're not native. They're native to Australia. And they do suck up lots and lots of water. They're extremely flammable. We've had all these fires in California this year and fires in Australia.
In Australia,
and those trees just absolutely, they have a lot of resin in them, and so they just
explode.
Completely explode when they get hot enough. And that's a huge issue. Like in Brazil, where they have a lot of eucalyptus plantations, the folks down there call them green deserts because, again, they're not native and they don't have the biodiversity of the native forests, and they are cutting down native forests to grow these.
Plant them.
Yeah. So we're losing native forests when we do these GE trees as well, and then they just suck up all the water, and the birds aren't in there, the insects aren't in there, and the people have to travel farther for their herbs and for their medicines and all those things. And yeah, they call them green deserts because they're green, but there's basically no life in there, and they've dried up all of their wells.
You know, if they want to create some, not that I'm saying they should, but you know, rather than make them grow faster or be sterile, why don't they figure out a way to make them grow without using as much water? Well, as we're going into droughts, you know.
Well, they are working on drought tolerance as well.
Oh, nuts.
But it's interesting if you think about it, depending on what your view of nature is, and how strong and how correct or how all-knowing or whatnot. None of these traits are found in nature. Trees don't produce their own BT.
Right.
Trees aren't sterile. Corn isn't producing BT. Corn isn't sterile. So they're introducing these absolutely novel foreign traits into these crops.
And no way to control them.
Exactly. And of course, with trees especially, they're very complex organisms. They're way more complex than humans. Based on the number of genes that they have. We have about 22,000 genes in humans. Some trees, like the Douglas fir, is about 300,000.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
And so they've done these studies, these field trials, and of course you'll never hear about this unless it's from an activist who's done their research. In Germany, they did a field trial where they tried to make these trees sterile, and they gave the field trial a 5-year life cycle, knowing that these poplars usually start to become fertile at 7 years. And within the first 3 years, a large number of these trees became fertile. They don't usually become fertile until 7 years.
That's half the time.
They, quote, made them sterile, and then they became fertile at 3 years. So when they insert these genes, basically pretty willy-nilly, they don't know what the other effects are, because when you insert a new gene, you're bumping one off or you're tearing another one.
Domino. They're like dominoes.
Yeah. And so that engineering might actually work. Like you might actually have that trait work for a little bit, but then there's RNA, and then there's environmental factors, and there's stress, and there's drought, and there's salinity, and there's a hurricane. I mean, there's all these different environmental factors that might affect how that tree reacts. And these trees, what they found in these field trials, they are basically silencing the gene that was inserted into them. So they decided, we don't like this gene, we don't need it, so we're going to shut it off, and it also is affecting them in other ways. So these trees became fertile after 2 years, and they grew faster. And the basic premise of genetic engineering is Crick's theory, that says one gene causes or makes basically a single protein that then makes or creates a single inheritable trait. It's a very simple 1 to 1 to 1. So the industry thinks this gene does this, we'll insert it here, it will make this protein, it will cause this trait, the BT expression, or sterility, or low lignin, etc. And that theory was completely debunked when they finished mapping the human genome.
Mm-hmm.
So humans have something like 100,000 traits. Earlobes that are attached, earlobes that aren't. Different
Innies and outies on a belly button.
Innies and outies, exactly. All these different things. And so when they finished mapping the human genome, they expected to find between 100 and 200,000 genes in us. And when they finished mapping it the first time, they found about 30,000. And now that number has come down to about 22,000. So the idea of one gene causing one protein to then cause one inheritable trait is out the window.
Too much going on for 20,000 to cover that.
And life is way more complex than these folks are even willing to accept. It's a mechanistic reductionist ideology that says, well, it's like our laptops or these, cameras. We can make these things, so why can't we make nature do the exact same thing? And we can't.
You're talking about the way scientists looked at things in the 1700s and the 1800s. We haven't progressed beyond that mechanistic view.
Nope.
And that's what's allowing this the genetically engineered stuff to fly, because the viewpoints, the organic viewpoints, aren't being expressed. They're being suppressed by organizations or corporations like Monsanto. They won't allow books and articles out that would try to educate people, and they've done this in the past.
Yeah, they suppress any science that looks or that finds negative aspects about genetic engineering, and they're very good at it because they're a multi-billion-dollar company, and they have lots of ex-employees in government regulatory agencies.
And future employees, because they're going to come right back.
Future, there's a whole revolving door between the industry and the regulatory system in the U.S. and all the other countries where they operate. Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about this, and there we go. I was just going to ask for that. You might, Gen Trees, is that how it is? Genetically Engineered Tree Speaking Tour.
Sure.
And this is going to be going on all the way up to, well, I can't say the Northwest, Pacific Northwest. And there's the he's got the poster up there for it.
Yeah, I mean, we're going from Ashland to Vancouver, British Columbia, from October 12th to the 23rd.
And there's 2 other speakers besides yourself?
2 other speakers, Ricarda Steinbrecher from England, from London, and then Ruddy Turnstone from the GE Tree, or the Stop GE Trees campaign and Global Justice Ecology Project. And she's based in Florida.
And so each one is going to be covering a different aspect of this, probably?
Yeah, the scientist is going to do the science.
The real science.
The hardcore science. I know a little bit about it, obviously. And then I'm going to be talking, mostly about the apple tree and the poplars, and a little bit about ecology with the whole connection between forests and soils and plants and insects and all that kind of stuff. And then Ruddy is going to be doing more of the eucalyptus and then kind of global resistance to GEs.
Well,
trees.
As you know, I'm interested in all that, but the whole, like on the bark hikes, it's at the bark office on the bark hikes. What gets me more than anything is how it all fits together and how it all works together. And this genetic engineering, that seems to me, right off the top, that's the biggest problem with it, is because it's looking at it mechanistically, and they think they can do this and get a certain result, and there ain't no way that it's always going to work out that way.
And it's totally true. I mean, we can make a resistor for a laptop or any sort of electronic device, and that resistor always does this one thing, turns off or on or whatever. And so these scientists have taken that ideology, reductionist ideology, and placed it on nature. And they don't realize that nature is unbelievably more vastly complex than we can even imagine.
Mm-hmm.
So, but they are thinking that they can create basically a robot out of a tree. We will make this tree do what we want it to do, and it will always do that forever. Not realizing that there's all these other factors. That tree is part of this entire amazing ecosystem. Fungi, protozoa, bacteria, air, water, environment, soil, elevation, all these different things. And all of those come into play throughout the life of that tree. But with this reductionist ideology and viewpoint, they assume that they can make this tree do whatever they want forever and constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And even in these field trials, like I was talking about with the aspen, where it flowered early. There was another field trial of aspens where they tried to make it sterile, and it turned the wood red. So they inserted a gene to make sterility. It did make it sterile, but then it also made the entire wood on the inside of the tree red. But their thinking was that gene codes for one protein and only does this one thing, makes the tree sterile. Well, in this case, it didn't.
It didn't. Well, they've been. This is fairly new, and wasn't one of the first genetically engineered things a tomato that nobody would buy?
Yeah, the flavor saver tomato.
Yeah, and and they just kept going after that.
Yep.
And I forget is that what they put a fish protein or something in? I can't remember what they did.
The flavor saver, no, they actually just reversed a gene, a reductase gene in the tomato, and that made it not rot. Kind of like the Arctic apple with the non-browning. They kind of turned off a few genes in the Arctic apple. And the problem with the Arctic apple, or one of the many problems, there's about 11 genes. They're called polyphenol oxidase genes.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah, that deal with the browning of apples, and they have only affected 4 of them. So they've kind of stopped those 4 from being expressed. Those other, the other 6 out of those 10 or 11, they are part of the apple's resistance to insects and their like health. So who knows, like, what is actually happening in there? Because when they actually deregulated this apple, they didn't study what these other genes, whether they're expressing the same way or they're being impacted. They didn't study whether this apple is going to cross-contaminate with other apples. And all apples, to produce a good crop, need to cross-pollinate with another apple.
Right, they can't pollinate themselves.
Well, they can do a bunch of self-pollination, but to get a really good crop, they need pollen from another tree. So no matter what, these Arctic apples will be contaminating any other apple trees within a range of however long it takes for that pollen to travel.
And the wind, it can travel a long ways. Bees can travel a long ways.
Yep.
Yeah, that's how nature, the whole mechanism, that's the wrong word, the whole organic thing that nature is, it all works together.
Yeah.
Well, they've been doing this for some time, and off the top of your head, is there any other, like we've had the BT corn, which is a corn that has that thuringus or whatever.
Bacillus thuringiensis.
Yeah, they have that in there, and there's a lot of different genetically engineered products. I think 90% of our soy and that much of our our corn and all this. Or has there been any issues like you talked about with the wood turning red and some of these other?
Well, one of the big things, especially for farmers who've decided to accept this technology or use this new kind of seeds,
into it,
especially with BT, and this will happen with the BT poplars or the BT eucalyptus or any other trees that they decide to insert Bacillus thuringiensis pesticide into. When you put a pesticide into the environment, and in these trees it will be expressed in every single cell of the entire tree, including the pollen, the seeds, the leaves, roots, bole, trunk. When you put that pesticide in the environment 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, you are guaranteeing that you are going to get insects that will become very quickly resistant to that BT. We've already found that in corn, the corn borer, the cotton boll weevil, all these other insects in our other agricultural crops.
Antibiotics too.
Right. So we've already had all these insects become resistant to BT in these agricultural crops. And now they're going to do it to trees. And again, with the poplar at least, there's dozens and dozens of moth species that are dependent upon the poplar for their survival. And when you put Bt out there, it will kill some of them, and then eventually, very quickly, the ones that are resistant to that Bt will be the dominant.
Or don't get a heavy dose of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And they'll be the dominant ones, and then you will have created this huge pest problem. So the cycle of genetic engineering is insert a problem into a tree, create a bigger problem, then insert another trait or another gene sequence into it, and then that gets figured out by the insects and the viruses and the environment, or even the tree silencing it. And then you just keep inserting new genes. I mean, that's their whole system. They're already double and triple stacking traits into corn and other agricultural crops because the first one failed.
Yeah. And it seems to me that, through TV or whatever the kind of media is, the viewers are all programmed to react to really heavy duty, like the floods recently and the fires and all these terrible cataclysms, when these really low level but very large magnitude, but they come on but beneath your view, they don't even have the education or the ability to see that could happen. It seems to me they're so used to it being terrible cataclysms that grab their attention, like what's going on in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
But
there is a cataclysm.
Yeah, isn't that? And a lot of what's going on in Washington, D.C. is, we should probably mention this because I'm going to have somebody on next week to talk about something called the Dark Act. And I know that Mark's not really familiar with this, but you know a little bit about it, that Monsanto was in there trying to cut off the ability of individual states, cities, or whatever to demand labeling.
Yeah, I mean, Monsanto has their operatives or their lobbyists in full force, working constantly to try and overturn the Vermont law to require labeling. They fought here and they donated against the initiative here to do labeling. Washington, California. I mean, they're everywhere supporting the status quo, basically, and they are trying to enact a law that will make it illegal for any state to require labeling. So right now, the activists are going literally state by state and trying to enact labeling. We failed in Washington, failed in California, failed by 0.8% in Oregon.
Just barely.
Well,
yeah.
Very barely. And then Vermont has passed, and a couple other states have passed in the East Coast. And so Monsanto has decided, well, let's just get rid of it entirely. Let's make it so that nobody can pass a law, as opposed to doing these individual battles. And so they're trying to do this Dark Act, which they tried before and hasn't worked, and now they're trying again. And if that happens, then no state will be able to pass labeling.
Well, eventually it'll get to the Supreme Court.
And it will, and I've got to tell you that Monsanto has never lost a lawsuit.
That's true. and it would
unfortunately.
Just, of course, that would have to get past Obama too, then, wouldn't it?
Yeah, Obama, before he got elected, when he was running, he had mentioned numerous times that he was for labeling, and if he got elected president, that he would enact labeling.
Well, he hasn't done that.
Well, it's 7 years in.
Yeah,
and
I don't expect that.
Yeah, I don't either. So, I mean, a lot of people say a lot of things, and then they don't follow through.
He could allow labeling, though.
He could certainly allow labeling. And, Monsanto is now suing the state of Vermont, and lots of our activist organizations are helping the state of Vermont, raising money for their lawyers to actually
this
fight.
Is a small state. They don't have a lot of tax base or anything.
Yeah. So we're rallying and we're fighting basically Monsanto through Vermont because they're trying to nix or kill their labeling law.
I know they also try through Salem and the different state houses too, and I'm surprised it didn't work there too. Yeah. But I guess they're going for the big banana there in D.C. because there's that's a city of lobbyists. That's what that's all about. It's not about truth, justice, and the American way anymore. It's about how much money you can put into someone's pocket.
Yep.
And apparently they succeeded with the House, which is not a big surprise. And is this kind of a party thing, or the Republicans are coming down for it because they're so corporate And the Democrats are kind of hedging, or are there Democrats on board with it? Or
It's strictly business. If you ever look at any of these sites or these folks who track donations from businesses, they don't care who's in office.
Mm-hmm.
They'll donate to the Republicans and the Democrats. Monsanto is one of them. Shell, I mean, all these companies.
Coca-Cola.
They're obviously a little more, maybe Republican in their thinking to begin with, but they donate to any party that's in office, anybody who's in control.
Yeah, and they also, another thing they do is they donate to the person who's running against you.
Right.
That's another way to do it. They just won't give you money, but they'll give it to the person, that's running against you. Maybe that's how some of these, like Kucinich, and he lost his party in the primary.
Yep.
And maybe the party put money into the people, or the corporations put money into the people on the other side of the aisle there to get him out of there. And that's the mechanizations is terrible that's going on there. And so getting back to that, next week we're going to have somebody to come on, hopefully a couple people to come on and talk about this specific issue of the genetic engineering labeling, because they're gearing up to do it again eventually in Washington or California or Oregon or a number of other states. And if Obama signed it, which he's done some things I wouldn't think he would, but if he does, and then it's going to have to go to the Supreme Court. But meanwhile, it'll be against the law, probably, and it just doesn't seem possible that that could happen. But it's not an issue with the trees, I don't imagine, because the trees won't be a matter of consumption. It'll be what the trees are turned into, whether it's fuel or...
Well, but citizens would like to know if their 2x4 or their ream of paper came from genetically engineered trees.
Sure.
And if this act is passed, then there'll be no labeling of anything.
Even whether it's grown sustainably,
well,
then?
No labeling whether it's GE or non-GE.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Because people care whether the stuff is like trees are harvested sustainably or
right.
That sort of thing. There's that aspect of it. It won't affect that, and people do shop that way.
Yeah, and currently, for a certification system, the FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, does not allow genetically engineered trees to be certified as FSC.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one aspect, and I mean the industry knows all this, right? Which is why they do these workarounds, the dark act or greasing the palms of politicians, because they know. I mean the polling is clear on genetically engineered foods. 90% of Americans want labeling. 60% of that 90 want labeling so they can make the choice at the grocery store shelf to not buy it.
And the genetic engineering industry knows that.
Absolutely, which is why they do the dark act or they do it secretly, and they don't label it voluntarily themselves.
It all might have gone down a different road if they would have gone ahead and tested the stuff and proven it, but the stuff is not proven. That's my biggest complaint about it. It's not proven, and it hasn't been tested.
Right. I mean, as an activist, on these sustainable ag and anti-genetic engineering issues, our biggest push is for the precautionary principle. So when Steve Strauss and all these scientists say, well, we're trying to make these trees sterile so that they won't cross-contaminate, that's only one aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with poplar trees, they will resprout from their roots, and any branch or twig that comes off will resprout. And then, of course, you can't get 100% sterility to begin with anyway. And even beyond that, what are the interactions with the Bt pesticide toxin, being released from the roots and from the leaves and whatnot? You have to have this entire huge study. And basically at this point, with the amount of knowledge that we understand and the science that we know about ecosystems and trees, there is not a protocol to be able to approve GE trees and actually study their entire environmental or ecosystem level effects. We just don't know enough about forests and ecosystems and all these interactions. So we really shouldn't even allow these from the get-go. We cannot actually test their safety. And when these businesses and these scientists and these companies say, oh, we've found that it's safe, of course our regulatory system also finds that it's safe because it's bunk.
A lot of times that it's because the testing is being done by the corporations that are producing the stuff.
Basically, the EPA, the FDA, and the USDA just looks at the reports that the biotech industry gives it. They don't do any independent extra safety testing. If Monsanto said that this tree is fine, or Arborgen said that this GE eucalyptus is totally safe for the environment, that's what they do. That's what the agency approves.
Being a lover of nature, it would just seem to me that they've already, all those tests and reports and all have already been done. It's called Mother Nature.
Yeah.
You know, she's already showed us what works and what doesn't work. If something doesn't work, it goes extinct. And looks like, you know, what we're doing is tampering with something that is way beyond our comprehension. And, you know, we could be creating our own extinctions as we are in other areas.
And that's why I was saying Mother Nature doesn't have these traits. Doesn't have sterility, and it doesn't have the Bt production in every cell of the plant. And if Mother Nature isn't doing it, well, I don't think we should either.
No, yeah.
And again, I mean, the other base point is money. They're looking to corner markets and control markets, and then to control and dominate and domesticate these plants, these trees. And it's literally all for money. And like I said, it's a solution in search of a problem. We have ways of getting fiber for our paper needs from canaf or hemp, or more recycling, or reducing waste, getting rid of junk mail. We can use a little bit of lemon juice to make our apple slices not brown. Lemon juice tastes good.
Sure.
We didn't actually have to, spend all this money to engineer it and change the genes in it. And we have no idea what that change of those genes is going to do to this tree. They've studied it for 3 or 4 years.
And they don't care.
Well, and they don't care. They want to, and he got it on the market. Neil Carter, the owner of Okanagan Specialty Fruits, got it on the market fairly quickly. It's the second tree to be genetically engineered, or commercialized.
What was the first? The poplar?
The plum.
Oh, the plum.
Yep. Which basically nobody's growing. Papaya is not actually a tree. Everybody thinks papaya was
a bush or a shrub?
It's a shrub.
Yeah. So, well, we've eaten up 45 minutes of the show already. We had a video we were going to play. You want to continue on, or?
Well, let's do some video.
All right. So I'll explain a little bit about the video here, and it's called Synthetic Forest.
Yep.
All right, and it goes into, it probably repeats a lot of what we've talked about, but it's interviewing different people, different activists,
probably
farmers
15, 20 different activists, kind of like me, saying some really good points on GE trees as well.
GE trees, and I want to remind folks that the tour is coming up. We might get that graphic up one last time. I know you just had it up, but we were talking about something else, and there it is, and that's going to be that. Bark office is what's happening here, but it's also in Eugene. It's not in Salem though, I noticed, but it's in Eugene, Corvallis, and all the centers with colleges looks like a lot.
Oh yeah,
yeah. And then of course Portland's going to be a week from tonight, which is a shame because I'm not going to be able to videotape that, but because we got a show, as I said, we've got a program with some folks that want to talk about the Dark Act and stopping Monsanto from putting a kibosh to genetically engineered labeling. We have a right to know what's in it, and there's no way that is constitutional. At least, with our present Supreme Court, maybe it is. I don't know, but then anyway, and folks can tune in next week. And I want to thank the crew for putting this together for us in there, and Mark for coming on and talking about this. Folks want to go to the Bark office on the week from tonight. It's between 6 and 8. You can go to bark-out.org to find out a little bit more about Bark. Mark and I were both on the board there, and we've been working with those folks and for some time. And you can learn a little bit about Bark while you're there.
Absolutely.
So, all right.
Another great organization.
Another great organization. Yeah, good. It's been around not as long as as a Rage, but
Right.
Rage has been what, the early '90s, wasn't it?
Oh, 99 actually. So
Oh, about the same.
we're
then.
almost the same age. Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, thanks again, and we'll go into that video. We'll play it. You know, it's about 3 times as long as you're going to see, but you can look up synthetic forest on YouTube and see the whole thing if you'd like.
Yeah.
So tune in next week, and we'll see you then.
Thanks, Jim.
All right. Thank you.
The prospect of GE trees and the corporations that are pushing this technology it's really breathtaking. I mean, they're looking at 184 million acres of forest around the world. So their dream is to cut down all those forests and instead have these industrial, monocultured, essentially tree factories. No insects, no birds, no ecosystem, no life. These trees aren't really even trees. Any natural behavior of a tree is inhibited. So imagine that. That's their dream. That is where they're going to make their money. Down go all the forests, up come these tree factories by millions and millions of acres, these monocultures, whether they're going to be eucalyptus or poplar. That's their dream. That's going to be all these trees that they're then going to cut down and plant every couple of years for fuel.
They actually want to release 500 million genetically engineered trees all over the southeast for biomass burning every single year.
Recently, Congress set a goal for cellulosic biofuel production, 22 billion gallons. The USDA projects that the Southeast, with its natural diversity and its long growing season, will produce half of that total, nearly 11 billion gallons.
But the second biggest use for atrazine in the U.S. is in forestry. So when the trees are cut, my understanding is the atrazine is then applied aerially to prevent any weeds or competition from growing up while they replant the trees. Atrazine is the #1 contaminant of drinking water, surface water, rainwater, aquifers, groundwater, you name it, atrazine's in it. Atrazine's associated or correlated with a number of reproductive health problems in humans. So, for example, it's associated with low sperm count, it's associated with an increase in breast cancer, it's associated with an increase in prostate cancer, it's associated with at least 3 birth defects.
And I think we've all probably experienced what happens when a poplar tree goes into cross-pollination. It's almost like a snow event. The pollen is so prolific and travels so far.
The pollen blowing on the wind that we breathe, certainly the inhalation route is just as powerful as consuming.
In 2009, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine reviewed the animal feeding studies and said these animals are so sick and suffering, no one should be eating GMOs. They're suffering from gastrointestinal problems, immune problems, reproductive problems, accelerated aging, organ damage, and problems with cholesterol and insulin. So we've seen since then more evidence that GMOs are unsafe, both at the laboratory level, among livestock that are switched from GM to non-GM or vice versa, and we can see the differences in their health, and to humans who've stopped eating GMOs, and they and their physicians, by the thousands now prescribing non-GMO diets, describe health improvements. What's going to happen if they introduce plums or apples that are genetically engineered? It can affect every other plum and apple seller in the country and export markets.
We are contributing to the evolution of this story, applying biotechnology in the development of genetically modified trees, such as eucalyptus, aiming to enhance our company's competitiveness.
That means that if these companies are trying to engineer eucalyptus to have even more volatile oils, that could really raise some serious questions about what would happen if there were an adverse event like a fire that might actually help spread the fire, because at least in California some of those eucalyptus trees were just like torches. When the fires would get high and were blowing through the Oakland Hills, they would almost explode, and they helped exacerbate the whole problem of wildfires in California.
So when you burn wood, per unit of energy generation, you actually release more carbon into the atmosphere than you would if you were burning coal. The other thing is that burning wood for electricity produces a whole bunch of other pollutants, including particulates, very fine particulates like the ultrafine and nanoparticulates, which are very, very damaging to human health because they can bypass all of the protective mechanisms in the lungs and enter directly into bypass cell membranes and deliver straight into the bloodstream.
We're already seeing, massive plantations in places like Brazil, in those kind of tropical and subtropical climates down there, and they're a disaster. Any monoculture is going to be a disaster, and anything at the wrong scale is going to be a disaster. And so if you add GE trees to the kind of monoculture plantations that are already in existence down there, you just exacerbate a really bad problem, making it worse.
And now they come in with the GE trees to make things worse. The industrial tree monocultures are already very bad for communities. We have done 20 years of studies and talking with communities, and all the places communities complain that we didn't ask for these plantations and they have caused a lot of problems. They have removed many people, and now with the GE trees things will get worse because these trees are can come in more regions. If these trees are resistant to the herbicides, they can speed up the cycle. The cycle is like 5 years. For these biomass plantations, the cycle is 1 to 2 years, and they will plant more trees per hectare. For pulpwood plantation, they plant between 1,500 and 2,000 trees. For biomass plantation, they will plant up to 8,000 trees. And with the GE trees technology, they think they can more than duplicate the production.
The forests do not need agriculture, so it's not symbiotic, but agriculture needs the forests. So this idea of cutting down all the forests, getting rid of all those pollinators, all those insects, all those birds, all that life that we need to help us in our agriculture to create these monocultured industrial long lines of fertilized biofuel trees that are barely trees at all, it is not only disastrous for our situation with climate change and climate disruption, it's actually a disaster for our food security. And we at the Center for Food Safety, we care about food security.
So these are the kind of things we have to pay attention to long before we release anything that has genetically engineered pollen. Because once you release it, everyone in the environment, everyone in the area is going to be affected, especially those that are highly sensitive.
I used to work for the federal government. I was an attorney for the USDA. And I believe that the proper role of the government is to protect the public, to protect our health and safety, to protect the environment. And there are a lot of good people working for federal government in these agencies. But at the policy level, it's called regulatory capture. What's going on now at the federal government is that the private industry has been able to take over the regulatory system. And so government has basically abdicated its role in protecting the public health. Should the public be notified about something as incredibly serious as genetically engineered forests? Absolutely. I was doing some research on the loblolly pine, and that's one of the few trees. The reason I think they genetically engineered it is because they finally sequenced its entire DNA. And this pine tree has a genetic makeup that's 7 times more complex than human beings. So we have this organism that can grow 115 feet tall, and it can live and make seeds and spread pollen for 50 years. And it's part of a great forest environment where the birds eat the seeds. So there are 20, I think, different species of birds and small mammals for whom the loblolly pine seeds are their diet. Not to mention all the other organisms that are involved in the soil and the roots and throughout the forest. We don't know how this organism is going to interact in the environment. We don't know how it's going to affect other animals, the roots and the soil, the water, other trees, or even ourselves. And the role of the federal government is supposed to be to protect ourselves, our health, our safety, the environment, And instead of doing that, they're allowing private companies to release these unstudied, unknown, and unpredictable organisms into the environment. My deepest value is the inherent integrity of the natural world, nature as it was given to us. And genetically modified organisms change all of that in ways that are unpredictable, and we just don't know what's going to happen in the long term to nature as it was given to us. So personally, I feel that the USDA, by allowing this private company to plant genetically modified tree plantations that spread their pollen for hundreds and maybe thousands of miles, that this is the equivalent of biological warfare.
My name is David Suzuki. I am, by training and profession, a geneticist. And for 25 years, I had an active career in science, once having the largest genetics lab in Canada. In discussions I've had with my fellow geneticists, they often say, listen, Suzuki, we're just talking about DNA. DNA is DNA. What difference does it make what organism it comes from? We pull it out of this organism, put it into another, it's just DNA. They forget a fundamental fact. We study the genetics of organisms by breeding a male and a female of one species, looking at their offspring and breeding them through what is called vertical inheritance within a species. When you take a gene from one species and transfer that DNA into a totally unrelated species, that's a completely different kind of experiment. This is now called horizontal inheritance. We've never done that before, and it is absolutely bad science to say that we can look at vertical inheritance and use the same ideas to explain what goes on in horizontal experiments. It's just lousy science.
You know, sometimes we forget, how do you get a wheat gene into a chestnut? I mean, how does that happen? What's that about, right? And here's how it happens. And this is not just true of chestnuts and many other things. You take the gene you want, the DNA that you want, you attach it to a vector, that is a bacteria, or a virus, because that's what, when we get sick, that's what invades our bodies, is a bacteria or a virus. So you take the gene, you attach it to this bacteria, and you put it in tissue culture, and it invades all the cells, and somewhere in that genome, in the DNA of that cell, it drops off the gene you want, somewhere in there. And they usually put little promoter viruses to make it work. So they call it a genetic cassette. You've got your bacteria, you've attached your DNA, and you have little promoter viruses working in there. And that cassette goes into every nucleus of every cell of that tree. It's really invasion technology. You are invading that cell with novel DNA that it has never seen before. The cell usually resists it, so you put in your viral promoters to promote that new protein that you've put in there.